Hello, welcome to this video, and on this video I'm going to look at my holy trinity of free jazz. So what is my holy trinity of free jazz? Well, what is free jazz? In the 1960s, jazz musicians, spurred on with the great cultural changes that were happening in the 1960s, start to explore different areas. And freedom, in every sense of the word, in the civil rights sense and also in the idea of musical freedom, became very, very important. Many jazz musicians feel that all jazz is about freedom. Jazz, once you understand the mechanics of it, it enables you to do whatever you want, but there are mechanics. And if you're playing jazz, especially after bebop almost creates a straitjacket within which you need to improvise. If you're a genius like Charlie Parker can make it sound like he's completely free, but he's actually jumping through the hoops of the chord progression and the structure of the song. Also, the hoops that come from bar lines and time and meter. Musicians throughout the 50s are pushing against that and trying to find ways of exploring freedom in every context, and there's a political aspect to freedom, there's a mutual, there's a musical, there's a cultural aspect. I became very interested in free jazz when I was younger, and I bought lots of free jazz albums. There were three monumental albums that really were the great sort of pillars of free jazz, and I'm going to talk about those albums, but they also were three of the most difficult albums I've ever bought to try and get my head around, right? And that is the thing with free jazz, it's a difficult form to listen to. In a recent interview with Greg Bendian, he said it's much easier to go and listen to a solo album or a duo album where you could just hear the conversation between two people, or you could hear one person just exploring sound worlds, and that's a much easier way of getting into free jazz. But these three albums I'm going to discuss now aren't that. They're actually large scale group performances. So two people going at it and playing whatever they want is a challenge, but when you've got, say, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 people all doing it, it can become almost cacophonous, and all these albums would definitely be described by most people as that. So what's the first one I'm going to talk about? The first pillar of my holy trinity of free jazz, the thing that sits there representing the form that you have to deal with, is the album that gave the genre its name, Free Jazz by Ornette Coleman. There it is. This was recorded in 1961. So Ornette Coleman has got the credit for sort of being the pioneer of free jazz. Of course he wasn't. Lenny Tristano was exploring free jazz ideas in the late 40s. I think Ornette Coleman's breakthrough was the way he was approaching freedom. When I first heard Ornette Coleman, it was difficult for me, and then I started to realise it was because I was listening to it with my ears that were rooted in normal jazz improvisation. And what Ornette Coleman does, I believe, is he gives everything weight. So in jazz improvisation, it's often the notes, the harmony, combined with rhythmical phrasing, where you have the weight. So if you're approaching a certain chord, you have to play notes related to that chord, right? Regardless of what your solo's doing, you would have to consider that chord. What Ornette Coleman does is say, well, you can consider that chord, but there's other things going on. The timbre that you're exploring might want to take the solo in a different direction. The shape of the phrase, may be taking you towards a note which isn't in tune, right? The nature of meter, of time itself, is that you may be playing in a way which is going outside the time. It's almost like saying taking every aspect of music and giving it equal weight. When he emerged in the late 50s with the album, Shape of Jazz to Come, that album is actually quite a listenable album. There's tunes there, there's heads, there's solos, and once you realise that they're following the internal logic of their improvisation as much as they are following the form. You realise that they are following the form. In 1961, he puts this band together, which is Ornette, Coleman, Don Cherry, the late great Scott LaFaro on bass, Billy Higgins on drums, Eric Dolphy on bass clarinet, Freddie Hubbard on trumpet, Charlie Hayden on bass, and Ed Blackwell on drums, right? And they go at it on 2 tracks, right? Oh no, sorry, 1 track, that's right. They go basically and do a 37-minute improvisation, which is titled Free Jazz. On this you get the first take as well, which is only 17 minutes long, so they did 2 takes. There's some structure on here, on all these albums I'm about to talk, there's some structure which is really sort of solo order and slight movements towards one musician another. What I think is very important on this album, it's not one big band, is it? It's 2 bands playing at the same time. You have Ornette Coleman and Eric Dolphy on sort of reed instruments, wind instrument. Coleman, of course, on alto sax, Eric Dolphy on bass clarinet. You have Don Cherry and Freddie Hubbard on trumpet. We have Scott LaFaro and Charlie Hayden on bass. And we have Billy Higgins and Ed Blackwell on drums. Alright? So we're actually listening to 2 bands. Now, once you realise this is the case, it opens the door to a way of listening. Right? Because you can choose just to listen to one of the bands. Once you can locate them, you could just listen to the Eric Dolphy, Freddie Hubbard, Charlie Hayden, Ed Blackwell band. How much that is part of the structuring of this, I don't know. I don't think they're following charts or reading any of this. This is free improvisation. But that dynamic would happen. But I imagine the dynamic that would have happened far more is the dialogue between the instrumentalists. Right? So if you've got 2 drummers, the 2 drummers are going to want to play with each other and play off each other. How do you accommodate 2 drummers? You know, does one play the time and the other not, or you both play the time, or do neither play the time? Do you break it up so someone is playing, you know, the toms and then someone's complementing that with the metallic parts of the drum kit, the cymbals and all that bit, or the rims? So it starts to open up a dialogue. You know, it's a conversation. In this case, it's a group conversation. Jazz has always been about questioning how the individual operates within the group. It's always had a political aspect to it. It's always related to, I think, the underpinnings of the American way. So at this point, at the civil rights movement in full sway, and jazz representing this sort of liberal democratic approach, but then it being pointed out that no, we're not living in that type of situation. This isn't an equal democracy where everyone's the same and they've all got their same, you know. And taking the very history of jazz, which has been so brilliant at portraying that, but throwing that into question, perhaps that's the key, that cultural thing, if I get the right way up. That's the key to this album, and maybe that's the key to all the other albums I'm going to discuss here. But this is the first cornerstone for me of free jazz, and the first difficult listen, and the first one that's really going to blow your mind when you put it on. Right, is that one. So let's move on to the next album on the list. It is Ascension by Coltrane. I've got Ascension on this box set that also includes Kula Samama and Selflessness, right? But here we have an Ascension. And Ascension was I think recorded around 64, 65, not too sure. Shall we check it out? Of course, 1965 I think it's saying here, yeah. Thought so. Anyone casual viewer would look at Ascension and go, well, hang on, this is like a rerun of free jazz. Because Coltrane's done the same thing. Alright, what we have here is Coltrane's classic quintet. Himself, McCoy Tyner, Jim Garrison, Alvin Jones. And then it's supplemented by Archie Shepp and Pharoah Saunders on saxophone. So now we have 3 saxophones. We have John, I never know how to say this, Chikai and Marion Brown on alto saxophones, Freddie Hubbard and Dewey Johnson on trumpets, and then Art bass, Art Davis on bass as well as Jimmy Garrison. So it's not quite the double group that we have, but there is still this pairing going on. The group's even larger. One of the things that's interesting that's different from this to free jazz is there is only one drummer on it, and that's Elvin Jones. And then you have Coltrane, right? Separate, because we also have 2 tenor saxophones, 2 alto saxophones, and then we have Coltrane. When you listen to this album, and it is a difficult listen, I found it one of the most difficult listens. Some of the other free jazz albums, like Meditations, Interstellar Space, are easier listening experiences. This is one of the most difficult listening experiences in terms of Coltrane, and I think it's because of the size of the band and they're all going at it. It is sort of organised. There is a sort of vague head, and then there is a sequence of solos. When I listen to Coltrane's free jazz albums, the key for me is always Coltrane. To listen to what Coltrane's doing and then suddenly become aware that it's not that different to what he's doing on earlier albums. It's Coltrane's approach. And he will, on this album, and I think this is why this album's so difficult, because there's not that much Coltrane on it. Once he's done his solo, he's gone. And then we're listening to Pharaoh Saunders and Dewey Johnson, all these people taking their solos over 40 minutes. But Coltrane's solo sets the stage for me, and I think what we've got going on here is that Coltrane's approach to freedom is entirely different to Ornette Coleman's. Ornette Coleman is exploring freedom by basically, like a sort of mad court jester in the court of jazz, just go, it's almost like absurd, where he just goes, well, let's just be free. Let's just follow the logic of where we're going. Whereas Coltrane has come at it by looking at modal approach, looking at the Coltrane matrix, which is the way he tries to break harmony on giant steps, where he's trying to playing all the keys at once, using Western cadences, but using them in sort of almost like a 3-dimensional approach to break the harmony open and break it outside. He's pushing the rock of jazz history up this hill, right? Trying to push freedom forward, and every time he gets to that point of reaching the summit of a certain peak, he meets Ornette Coleman, who's just doing it anyway. And so Coltrane must have been very informed by what Ornette Coleman's doing. I think his interest was piqued, and so he's heard free jazz and he's exploring it himself now, and it's Coltrane's take. And the way he does it is to put himself in the comfort of his old quintet, right? That's the last summit, and try and reach the next summit by opening the door to these new players like Pharaoh Saunders that are really coming as much out of Ornette Coleman as they are out of Coltrane. That are just, for me, just direct explorers of free jazz. It's like, rather than how do we get there, how do I push the music to that point, they're just being free. That's the change that's happened. He's opening up to these new players. And when you hear Ascension, that's what you hear. You hear Coltrane solo, and then you hear the reaction of his classic quintet to these new players. Of course, the reaction wasn't that great, and they all sort of dropped out. I think Jimmy Garrison being the last guy to go. I think once he brought in new freer drummers, Elvin Jones just couldn't, deal with it. And these guys loved Coltrane. As that classic quintet drips away, the critics found the later Coltrane difficult. I don't. I absolutely love it. And the way in is through Interstellar Space, where you've just got drums and saxophone. But here, we still, underneath it all, have drums and saxophone. Right at the top and bottom, with this huge band in the middle, we have at the top Coltrane and Elvin Jones at the bottom. Right? And that is the way I think to approach, is to listen to Elvin and see how he's underpinning it. Because it gives you a base back to the classic quintet. I'm just going to pull an album. It just happens to be out, because I was talking about it on another video, on the Patreon video. This is the album I grew up with. Way before I ever heard Ascension was this album. John Coltrane live in Paris. This is also recorded in 1965. It's just the classic quintet, and this is the classic quintet, you know, just before Elvin leaves. So this is the classic quintet as free as they got. This is well worth listening to as well, and will help you understand what the hell is going on with Ascension. Right, the last album in this Holy Trinity is another large-scale recording. I was going to do a video at some point called the most unlistenable album ever made, which I think this is. This is the peak. This is the most noisiest, extreme, explosive free jazz album ever made, and it's of course this one. This aesthetic is European. It comes out of free jazz, it comes out of Ascension. It's another large group recording, but it's come out of Europe. It's recorded in 1966 by Peter Brötzmann, and it also features a, sorry for the pronunciation of these European names, Willem Brucker on tenor sax, Evan Parker on tenor sax, Fred Van Hove on piano, Peter Kowald on bass, Bushi Nybergård on bass, and then two drummers, Han Bennick and Sven Acker Johansson. Right, what we have on here again is 2 takes of Machine Gun. One's 15 minutes long, one's 17 minutes long, and there's some other tracks. There's a track called Responsible for Jan van der Wenck van Hove. 2 takes of that, 10 minutes, 8 minutes, and then there's music for Han Bennick Brucker, 11 minutes. This is like taking free jazz and then going punk. Look at the artwork. Look at this. Look at the title of it. If we see free jazz as being the album, as being sort of this sort of plugged into the civil rights movement, then we see the spirituality that Coltrane brings to Ascension, which I didn't mention, but that's the big difference between Ascension, is their spirituality. Well, this is like the opposite of that. Look at this. This is just pure, modern, you know, it's aggressive, you know, and this came out at the same time as the Paris riots. This is like anarchistic, right? So all 3 of these albums have a completely different flavour. You know, anyone says, oh, well, they all sound the same. They do not understand what's going on. Look at this here. Look, this sort of rough photocopy here of the liner notes. This album is good. We got this to see. We've got, you know, some fantastic photos there of the band together, the incredible Peter Brötzmann. This album really is something else. It's like a lot of students that are listening to like thrash metal and death metal and black metal, and they think they've reached the limit of what music can be in terms of noise. I play them this, and then they go, "Oh my God," because this is so far. It's so far out compared to anything else. Peter Brötzmann is playing the saxophone at the limits of human endurance. You know, he's turned it into a literal musical machine gun. It really is just out to destroy. The whole band is going for it, full blast. And then it's exacerbated by some of the worst recording you've ever heard in life, some of the worst production. You're aware of this huge group in a room, and the album starts off very free, and it's like, oh my God, this is very free, and it sounds all over the place and noisy. And then after a minute or so, suddenly Brötzmann kicks in, and it's right on the limits of human endurance, right? And I think this is the point. This is the point of this album. Not all free jazz is like that. Some free jazz is trying to create beauty. It's trying to create space. It's trying to create, you know, represent different mathematical formulas, or you know, paint a picture of a landscape. But this album isn't. This album is a statement, and it's about the limits of our humanity. To me, when you listen to something like this, you will be confronted with how long do I listen to this? How long do I put up with this? How can I take this? Can I keep listening to this? What does it all mean? And it focuses you in the now. It makes you realise that you're here right now listening to that. And if you're if you're loving every minute of it, you're in the moment. But if you're not, you are waiting for it to be over. Right? The pain of it, you're waiting for that to be over. And is that what it's really about? Is that just a metaphor for our lives? That so often we can just see our lives as pain, and most of the time we're just waiting for it to be over. The idea of that we are all embracing death rather than the joy of life. And maybe this album's about both of those things. Maybe it's about joy and death. Don't know. That's my take on these 3 albums. I hope you enjoyed it, and I will be back on the next video. If you like this, if you want to subscribe, and if you want more of this stuff, you know, say you want more, because I'm into some pretty heavy territory here. And if you haven't heard Machine Gun or Ascension or Free Jazz, go and listen to them now, but approach with caution. Thank you very much.